Keanu Reeves stepped into the busy airport like he was just another traveler. He wore a plain hoodie, simple jeans, and carried a small bag on his shoulder. There was nothing flashy about him, no sign that he was a Hollywood star loved across the world. He walked with calm steps, not rushing, not pushing, just quietly making his way through the crowd. The airport itself was alive with noise. Announcements echoing, children crying, travelers dragging heavy suitcases. Some people were running to catch flights while others sat half asleep on benches. In the middle of this storm of movement, Keanu stood out in a strange way, not because he looked famous, but because he looked too calm, too relaxed. It was as if he didn't belong in the chaos. A pair of airport police officers noticed him. Their eyes narrowed as they whispered to each other. To them, he didn't look like a movie star at all. He looked like someone trying too hard to stay unnoticed. Someone who maybe had something to hide in their job. They were trained to catch suspicious behavior, and Keanu's peaceful aura felt suspicious to them. Keanu walked forward and stood in line. He looked around politely, smiled faintly at a crying child, and adjusted the strap of his bag. To him, this was just another day of travel. He had no idea that the officers had already decided to keep an eye on him. The officers followed at a distance. They whispered again, "Look at him. He doesn't even look nervous. Why is he so calm?" To them, calmness was not a good thing. To them, calmness could mean someone was trained, someone who wanted to blend in, someone dangerous. Keanu took a deep breath. He was used to being stared at by fans, but this time he felt something different. He could feel eyes watching him with suspicion. Not admiration. He ignored it and kept moving forward. The line was long and slow. A small boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. Pointing toward Keanu, the child whispered, "Mom, that's John Wick." But the mother shushed him quickly. The officers, however, saw this little exchange, and in their minds it confirmed their fears. They thought the boy had recognized him for the wrong reasons. Maybe as someone dangerous. Keanu gave the boy a warm smile, raised his hand in a small wave, and then turned his eyes back to the front. To him it was a simple, kind gesture. To the officers, it was another red flag, they thought. Why is he drawing attention to himself now? Is he trying to distract people? Their doubts grew heavier with every step Keanu took. The crowd in line was restless. People shifted from one foot to another, checking their phones, sighing at the delays. Keanu, on the other hand, stood still. He looked patient, almost too patient, and patience in the eyes of the officers looked like planning, looked like strategy. One of the officers whispered, "I bet he's hiding something in that bag." The other nodded. "Let's keep watching. If he makes one wrong move, we'll step in." Keanu had no idea how close he was to trouble. He thought he was blending in, thought he was being normal, but to the wrong eyes. His calm behavior was being twisted into something else. He reached for his passport slowly, wanting to be ready when his turn came. His movements were soft, controlled, but again, the officers misunderstood. They saw control as practice. They saw stillness as danger. Minutes passed. But to Keanu it felt normal. To the officers, those minutes were filled with tension. They whispered into their radios, signaling others to stand by. The atmosphere around Keanu began to change. Passengers waiting in line didn't notice. But the quiet storm was building. Keanu looked ahead at the counter, wondering how long the line would take. He thought about maybe grabbing a coffee once he was past security. He thought about his destination, maybe about the people he would meet there. His mind was calm, gentle, just like his personality. But the eyes locked on him carried suspicion, judgment, and a readiness to act. It was a strange moment. Two worlds colliding without anyone realizing it yet. On one side, a humble actor moving like an ordinary man. On the other side, officers trained to expect the worst, mistaking kindness for trickery and calmness for danger. As Keanu finally stepped forward to the counter, the officers tensed. Their hands hovered near their belts, their eyes locked on his every move. He had no idea that the smallest action could trigger something big. The airport crowd moved as usual, but around Keanu, invisible threads of tension pulled tighter and tighter. The officers leaned forward, waiting, ready to step in, and all it would take was one misunderstood gesture for the storm to break. Keanu stood quietly in the line, his eyes calm as always. He didn't tap his foot like the other travelers. He didn't sigh loudly at the slow pace. Instead, he just waited, patient and steady. But to the officers watching from a short distance, this patience felt strange. They thought, why is he so relaxed? Normal passengers get irritated in lines. They show some frustration. But this man just stands there like a statue. Their whispers grew more serious. One officer leaned toward the other and said, "He's hiding something, I can feel it. Look at his body language. It's too calm." They were trained to find nervousness or overconfidence in travelers. But Keanu's natural calmness confused them. And in their confusion, suspicion grew stronger. A family stood behind Keanu in the line. The little boy who had spotted him earlier kept staring, his eyes wide with recognition. "That's John Wick," he whispered again to his mother. The mother looked at Keanu carefully. She frowned and shook her head. "No, honey. That's just a man who looks similar. Don't bother him." But the boy didn't believe her. He waved again at Keanu, who gave another gentle smile in return. This small interaction was harmless, but to the officers it looked different. They thought the boy had spotted Keanu for some darker reason, maybe thinking he was someone on a wanted list. One officer muttered under his breath, "Why is that kid pointing at him? Do they recognize him from somewhere?" Something's off here. The line moved slowly. Keanu shifted his bag on his shoulder, careful not to bump the person in front of him. He didn't know that this small movement made the officers tense even more. They whispered, "He's touching the bag again. Maybe he's preparing something. Keep your eyes on him." Their minds were building a story that had no truth in it. Meanwhile, Keanu's mind was far away. He thought about grabbing a coffee after the security check. He thought about the quiet moments he might have on the flight. He was used to long hours of travel, to delays, to being surrounded by strangers. None of this bothered him. He stood quietly, unaware that every move was being misread. The officers edged closer, pretending to check other passengers but keeping their focus on Keanu. They didn't want to scare the crowd, but they were ready to act. Their hands stayed near their belts, ready in case he made one sudden move. Their training told them to expect the worst, and so they did. Keanu glanced around the terminal casually. He noticed a tired mother carrying her baby. He noticed an old man adjusting his hat. He noticed the boy still staring at him with a smile. Keanu's lips curved in another faint smile. He thought nothing of it. To him, it was just the world around him. To the officers, it was suspicious, they thought. Why is he looking around like that? Is he checking for exits? Is he signaling someone? Their doubts grew heavier. More guards were called quietly over the radio. Soon, 3 more officers began blending into the crowd. All of them had their eyes on Keanu now. The passengers had no idea that so much attention was focused on one man in a hoodie and jeans. The air around him grew heavier with unseen pressure. Keanu finally reached the counter. He placed his bag down gently and searched for his passport. His movements were calm, almost too slow. He didn't want to rush. He believed in moving with care, but to the officers, this slowness looked like hesitation, like stalling, one officer whispered sharply. "He doesn't want to show his ID. Look at him dragging it out." The clerk at the counter smiled politely and asked for his documents. Keanu nodded, still searching through his bag. He found the passport and held it in his hand. He was about to pass it over when he felt the eyes again. Heavy and sharp on his back, he didn't turn around, but inside, he knew something wasn't right. The officers exchanged more whispers. "That's it, he's resisting, he's trying to buy time." Their eyes were sharp, their bodies tense, they were ready for action. And yet the truth was so simple. Keanu was just another man handing over his passport, just another traveler passing through security. The boy behind him whispered one more time, "Mom, it really is him, I'm sure. It's Keanu Reeves." The mother sighed. Annoyed now. "Stop imagining things, honey. Celebrities don't walk around airports like normal people. He's nobody, just forget it." But the boy refused to believe. His eyes stayed locked on Keanu. The passport slid across the counter. The clerk looked down, scanned it, and then looked back up at Keanu's face. Recognition flickered for just a second in the clerk's eyes, but she said nothing. She stamped the passport and handed it back with a small smile. Keanu nodded his thanks, picked up his bag, and stepped forward. But just as he did, the officers made their move. They stepped closer, blocking his path. One of them raised a hand. "Excuse me, sir. We need to ask you a few questions." Keanu blinked. Surprised but calm, he nodded slightly. "Of course." His voice was soft, polite, but in the ears of the officers it sounded careful, calculated. They mistook his humility for trickery. The crowd began to notice now. People turned their heads, wondering why this ordinary-looking man was being stopped. Some passengers pulled out their phones, sensing that something unusual was happening. The officers stood tall, their expressions hard, while Keanu stood still, his face calm but puzzled. He had no idea that their suspicion was about to spiral out of control. Keanu stood quietly as the officers blocked his path. His bag was still on his shoulder, his passport in his hand. He didn't look angry or upset, just a little confused. The officer in front of him cleared his throat and said firmly, "Sir, we need you to step aside for questioning." The crowd around them grew curious. Whispers spread quickly. Some people stopped moving just to see what was going on. Keanu nodded politely. Of course. His voice was soft and calm, but instead of easing the tension, his quiet manner only made the officers more suspicious, they thought. He's too calm. He's hiding something for sure. The officer motioned toward a small inspection area near the line. Over there, please. Keanu followed without complaint. His steps were slow and steady. His eyes lowered slightly as if he didn't want to cause any trouble. But to the officers, that humble look made him seem like he was trying to appear innocent on purpose. They asked him to put his bag on the table. Keanu obeyed. He set it down carefully, not slamming it, not rushing. The bag was small, just big enough for a few clothes, but the officers circled it like it was a dangerous object. Their hands hovered near their tasers as if they expected something to jump out. "Sir, can you show us your identification again?" one officer demanded. Keanu held out his passport politely. "Here it is." His voice carried no fear, no anger, but in the officers' minds this was strange. They thought a normal person would be frustrated by now, maybe even scared, yet Keanu was calm, too calm, and that made them nervous. The officer flipped through the passport, his eyes narrowing. He saw the name, but he didn't process it immediately. To him, it was just another document. He handed it back, but kept his eyes locked on Keanu. "Where are you headed?" he asked sharply. Keanu answered honestly, naming his destination. His voice was steady, respectful, but the officer's expression only hardened. "Why so vague? What are you really doing here?" he pressed. Keanu tilted his head slightly, confused. "I'm just traveling," he said simply. His words were plain, but the officers heard something else. They heard what they thought was a rehearsed line. The crowd watching grew larger. People whispered among themselves. A few passengers even started recording with their phones. They wanted to know why this ordinary-looking man was being singled out. The little boy who had recognized Keanu tugged at his mother's hand again. "See, Mom, it's really him," he insisted. The mother frowned but didn't say anything. Back at the table, the officers unzipped Keanu's bag. They went through it piece by piece, pulling out clothes, a book, and a charger. There was nothing suspicious inside. Everything was normal, but to the officers, the simplicity of the bag was suspicious in itself, they thought. Too clean, too empty. He must have hidden something somewhere else. Keanu watched quietly. Not protesting. He didn't complain about them touching his things. He didn't roll his eyes or argue, his silence was powerful. But again, it was misunderstood to the officers. Silence meant guilt, they thought. Why isn't he defending himself? Why isn't he asking questions? He must be guilty of something. One officer leaned closer and said in a stern voice, "You know, people who act calm usually have something to hide." Keanu looked up slowly, his eyes kind but puzzled. "I'm not hiding anything," he said. His words were soft, but the crowd around could feel the tension rising. The boy in the back shouted suddenly, "That's Keanu Reeves! Don't you know him?" His small voice broke through the murmurs of the crowd. Some people turned their heads sharply, now looking closer at the man under interrogation. They gasped. Some began to recognize his face, but the officers were too deep in their suspicions to hear the boy clearly. One officer stepped closer, almost nose to nose with Keanu. "Answer clearly," he demanded. "Why are you here? What's your purpose?" Keanu stayed calm. "I'm traveling, that's all." His answer was simple, but the officer saw it as defiance. His patience wore thin. The tension was like a rope pulled tight, ready to snap at any second. The crowd leaned in. The boy shouted again, "It's John Wick! It's Keanu Reeves!" His mother tried to hush him, but other passengers began nodding. Some whispered, "Wait, it does look like him. Could it really be?" Phones rose higher, recording every moment. The officers, however, didn't turn to look at the crowd. Their focus was sharp and heavy on Keanu alone, every small pause in his speech. Every slow movement of his hands was fuel to their suspicion. One officer muttered, "He's stalling, he doesn't want to give us a real answer." Another added, "He's too calm, let's be ready." Their words were low, but the mood was dangerous. They were building a storm in their own minds. A storm that had nothing to do with reality. Keanu, still respectful, placed his hands where they could see them. His voice was quiet but firm now. "I'm not resisting. I'm just traveling." But the more he tried to remain peaceful, the more they convinced themselves that something was wrong. The crowd's whispers grew louder. The boy's voice echoed one more time. "It's really him. You'll see." But before the truth could spread through the officers' minds, their suspicion reached its breaking point. The moment was coming when their doubts would turn into action. And Keanu, humble and kind, had no idea just how far things were about to go. The officers stood in a tight circle around Keanu. The tension was heavy now, like a storm about to break. Travelers passing by slowed down, many of them pulling out their phones. Some whispered nervously, others just stared. Nobody knew what this quiet man had done, but the police looked ready for something serious. Keanu stayed calm. His hands were still visible on the table, his bag open beside him. His voice had been soft, his words clear. But the officers weren't convinced. To them, his calmness felt like resistance. They thought he was playing some clever trick, "Sir. I'm going to need you to step back," one officer ordered sharply. Keanu blinked in surprise. He had already stepped aside, already obeyed every order still. He nodded and moved slightly. His slow movements, however, only made the officers more nervous. They exchanged looks, and one whispered, "He's stalling, he's waiting for something." Keanu lifted his hand carefully to adjust his hoodie. He moved slowly so they wouldn't feel threatened. But in that tense moment, even this small gesture looked suspicious. One officer's hand went straight to his taser. His eyes hard, his voice low, "Don't move." The crowd gasped. A mother pulled her child closer. A man lifted his phone higher, recording everything. The little boy who had recognized Keanu tugged at his mother's sleeve again. "Mom, they're making a mistake. It's him. It's Keanu Reeves." But the mother kept quiet, afraid of getting involved. Keanu froze, his hand halfway to his hoodie. He didn't argue, he didn't raise his voice. He simply lowered his hand again and said quietly, "I'm not resisting." His words should have calmed them, but instead, they made the officers think he was trying to control the situation. "Check his bag again," one officer barked. Another officer dug through the clothes again, shaking each item, tossing them on the table. Nothing appeared. Just the same book, the same charger, the same clothes. But the emptiness of the bag only made them more uneasy. "It's too clean, too empty," one officer muttered. He must be hiding something else. The air was thick with misunderstanding. Keanu stood silently, his eyes kind but puzzled. He didn't know how to convince them he was innocent. He had given them everything, shown them everything, but still, they were ready to believe the worst. One officer stepped closer, his voice sharp. "Show us what's in your pocket." Keanu nodded gently. He reached into his pocket slowly, carefully. He wanted them to see he had nothing to hide, but the very slowness of his action made the officers' hearts pound. In their minds, this was the moment he might pull something dangerous. Before he could even take out the small wallet in his pocket, one officer panicked with a quick motion. He pulled out his taser. The electric device crackled loudly, the sound sharp in the tense silence. The crowd gasped again, some people screamed. Others shouted, "Wait, stop, he's not doing anything." But the officer's finger had already pressed. The taser wire shot out, striking Keanu's chest in an instant. His body jerked violently, his knees buckled, and he fell to the cold floor. A wave of shock spread through the onlookers. A woman covered her mouth, a man shouted angrily. The boy's eyes filled with tears as he cried, "No. They hurt him!" Keanu lay on the floor, his body trembling from the electric shock. He groaned softly, not shouting, not angry, just in pain. The officers moved quickly, some holding him down even though he wasn't fighting back. Their faces were tight, their eyes cold. They thought they had just stopped something dangerous. The crowd, however, saw something else. They saw a humble man in simple clothes treated like a criminal. They saw a man who had done nothing, who had been calm and polite the whole time, brought to the ground by force. Angry voices rose. "What are you doing?" "He didn't do anything." "Let him go." Phones recorded every second. Dozens of cameras captured the moment Keanu Reeves, the beloved actor, was tased in the middle of an airport. The little boy's voice rose above the crowd. "It's Keanu! It's John Wick!" You heard him. His cries spread through the onlookers. Some people gasped as they finally recognized the man's face. Others began murmuring, "Wait, that really is him, isn't it?" The officers didn't notice yet. They were too busy holding Keanu down, shouting orders at each other. Their voices overlapped. "Get his hands. Check the bag again. Make sure he doesn't move." But Keanu was already lying still, not resisting, his face pale. Slowly, awareness began to spread among the crowd. People were whispering his name louder now. "It's him, it's Keanu Reeves. No way. That's really him. What have they done?" The murmurs turned into anger. People shouted at the officers, demanding they stop, demanding they look. The officers finally began to notice the noise. They glanced at the crowd, confused. They heard the name being repeated over and over. Their eyes shifted back to the man on the floor, and for the first time doubt entered their minds. Keanu, lying weakly on the ground, opened his eyes slightly. His face calm even in pain. His lips moved and he whispered softly, "I'm fine." His voice was weak but steady. It was the voice of a man who had suffered quietly, without anger. And in that moment, the officers began to realize that they had made a mistake. A terrible mistake. The faces that had been stern and hard started to change. The first cracks of regret appeared, but it was already too late. The whole world would soon know what had just happened in this airport. Gasps filled the airport hall. The crackle of the taser still echoed in people's ears. But now the crowd's voices grew louder. Dozens of passengers had their phones raised high, recording every second. Their shocked expressions turned into anger. They couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. Keanu lay on the ground, his body weak from the electric shock. His face was pale, sweat shining on his forehead. He wasn't moving much, only breathing heavily. Still, even in pain, his eyes held no hatred. He didn't shout at the officers. He didn't curse, he just lay there quietly, trying to recover. And then, a small but powerful voice broke through the noise. The little boy who had recognized him earlier screamed, "That's Keanu Reeves!" The words rang across the terminal. For a moment, it felt like time froze. The crowd looked at the boy, then at the man on the floor. They looked closer at his face, and realization began to spread like fire. One woman gasped loudly, "Oh my God, it is him!" Another whispered, "That's John Wick, that's Neo." Soon voices all around began repeating his name. "It's Keanu Reeves, it's Keanu Reeves." The officers froze. Their confident expressions cracked. One of them muttered under his breath, "No, that can't be." But the truth was right there in front of them. Phones zoomed in, faces leaned closer, and the crowd's energy changed from confusion to outrage. A man shouted, "You just tased Keanu Reeves. Do you even know who you're dealing with?" Another yelled, "Are you out of your minds?" The passengers who once stood silently were now furious. The officers exchanged nervous looks. Their pale faces revealed their sudden fear. The leader of the group swallowed hard. His eyes widened as he finally looked properly at the man on the ground. The features were unmistakable, the kind eyes, the calm face, the quiet humility. He whispered, "Oh no, it's really him." One officer bent down quickly, his voice shaky. "Sir, are you okay? Can you hear me?" His hands trembled as he tried to help Keanu sit up. The same officer who had been so harsh minutes ago now looked terrified. The others rushed to assist, panic written on their faces. The crowd didn't calm down, though. Angry voices grew louder. "You attacked him for nothing. He didn't even resist. Shame on you." The officers felt the pressure of hundreds of eyes burning into them. They knew the videos were already being sent out, already spreading across the internet. This was a disaster, and they couldn't undo it. Keanu, weak but steady, sat up slowly with the officer's help. His breathing was heavy, but he gave a small nod. "I'm okay," he whispered. His voice was soft, almost too gentle for the situation. That gentleness made the officers' guilt even heavier. They had just humiliated and hurt one of the most respected men in the world. A man known for kindness, and he was still forgiving in his tone. The officer who had used the taser felt his throat tighten. His hands shook. His face lost all color. He whispered to himself, "What have I done?" He couldn't even look into Keanu's eyes. The passengers, however, had no hesitation. They shouted angrily. Some called for the officers to be punished. Some demanded justice right there on the spot. The little boy cried out again, "He's a hero!" He didn't do anything. "Leave him alone!" His voice echoed with innocence and truth. making the scene even more heartbreaking. The officers tried to calm the crowd. "Please, step back, everyone. Please give us space." But their voices carried no power anymore. Nobody trusted them. Nobody believed them. They were the villains now in the eyes of the people. Keanu lifted his hand weakly, signaling for quiet. His calm presence slowly softened the crowd's anger. People respected him too much to ignore that gesture. Even in pain, even after humiliation, he still thought of others before himself. He spoke softly, his words almost like a whisper. "It's all right. I'm okay." His tone was gentle, forgiving, but his kindness only deepened the officer's shame. The crowd fell silent for a moment, watching this man show grace instead of anger. The officer who had tased him finally found the courage to speak. His voice cracked. "Sir, I'm so sorry, I didn't know, I thought—" But the words stuck in his throat. How could he explain? How could he defend the mistake of attacking a man who had done nothing? Keanu simply nodded. He didn't blame them with words. He didn't raise his voice. His silence was heavier than any anger could have been. It made the officers feel small, like children who had broken something precious. In that moment, the story shifted. The crowd no longer saw Keanu as a victim, but as a symbol of dignity and grace. The man they had just seen fall to the floor was still standing taller in spirit than the officers who towered over him. The officers' faces had truly changed now. The stern, hard expressions were gone, replaced by fear, regret, and shame. Their eyes darted around nervously. They knew their careers, their reputations, maybe even their lives outside the job would never be the same after this mistake. And as Keanu's name spread louder and louder among the crowd, one thing was certain. The world outside these airport walls would know soon too. Videos were already being uploaded, headlines already forming. The day the airport police tased Keanu Reeves was about to go viral. The airport was buzzing with voices. Some passengers shouted in anger, others murmured in disbelief. But one thing was clear. Everyone had seen the truth. The officers had just tased Keanu Reeves, a man known around the world for his kindness. His face, though pale from the shock, was unmistakable. The officers' confidence crumbled. The ones who had stood tall just moments ago now looked like guilty children caught doing something wrong. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide. Some of them avoided looking at Keanu. Others glanced nervously at the dozens of phones pointed at them. They knew this moment was being recorded from every angle. "And there was no way to escape it, sir, please. Forgive us," one officer stammered. He reached down to help Keanu sit more comfortably. His hands shook as he tried to steady the man he had just treated like a criminal. Another officer bent close, his voice trembling. "We didn't know who you were, we thought—" But his words died before he could finish. How could he explain such a mistake? Keanu sat quietly, breathing slowly. His chest rose and fell with effort, but his eyes were calm. He didn't shout, he didn't insult them. His silence made their shame heavier. He finally whispered, "I'm fine." His voice was weak but steady. The crowd, however, wasn't fine. Angry voices rose again. "You attacked him for nothing. He was calm the whole time. How could you tase Keanu Reeves?" Some passengers demanded the officers be removed immediately. Others shouted that Keanu should press charges. The officers looked around, trapped between the anger of the crowd and the quiet dignity of the man they had wronged. One woman stepped forward, pointing her phone directly at the officer who fired the taser. "We saw everything," she said loudly. "The whole world is going to see this." The officer's throat tightened. He could already imagine the headlines. The videos going viral. The endless judgment that would follow. The little boy's voice cut through again, filled with both fear and hope. "Mr. Keanu, are you okay?" The child's innocent words softened the noise for a moment. Keanu turned his head slowly and gave the boy the smallest smile he could manage. "Yes," he whispered. "I'll be okay." That simple answer made the boy nod proudly, as if his hero had just reassured him personally. The officers were drowning in guilt. One of them wiped sweat from his forehead. Another kept muttering, "What have we done?" They had thought they were preventing danger, but instead they had hurt a man who was respected everywhere. And not just any man. Keanu Reeves, a symbol of humility. Passengers began stepping closer, surrounding the scene. Some raised their voices at the officers. Others bent down to offer Keanu water. A young woman handed him a bottle, saying softly, "We love you. Please stay strong." Keanu accepted it with a nod. His quiet gratitude only made the crowd's anger toward the officers grow stronger. The officers tried desperately to calm the situation. Please, everyone step back, give him space. We're handling it. But nobody listened anymore. The power they once had in the terminal was gone. They were no longer the protectors in this story. They were the villains, and the people around them knew it. Keanu, with his gentle spirit, raised his hand slightly. His weak voice carried surprising strength. Please, don't be angry, mistakes happen. The words silenced the crowd for a moment. People looked at him in disbelief. He was the one hurt, yet he was asking others to forgive. That humility touched their hearts, but it also made the officer's shame unbearable. The officer who had pulled the trigger felt tears sting his eyes. He wanted to apologize again, but the words wouldn't come out. He knew no apology would be enough. His mistake was already carved into the memory of everyone in that terminal, and soon into the memory of millions more across the world. Keanu tried to stand, and 2 passengers rushed to help him. The officers also reached out, but the crowd booed them back. Don't touch him, you've done enough, someone yelled. The officers stepped back, their heads lowered. They had lost all respect, all control. They were powerless in front of the man they had tried to overpower. Slowly, Keanu stood with the support of strangers, his shoulders hunched but his face calm. He nodded at the people around him and said softly, "Thank you." That single word made the crowd cheer for him. It was a moment of unity, strangers standing together for a man they all admired. The officers hung their heads in silence. Their radios crackled, but none of them moved. They knew any sudden action would only make things worse. They could only watch as the crowd now protected the man they had attacked. In those moments, it was clear the story had already slipped out of their hands. They could no longer control the narrative. They could no longer explain their side. The videos were spreading, the anger was rising, and the world was about to see them as the villains who tased Keanu Reeves. And yet in the middle of it all, Keanu's calmness, his kindness, his quiet words of forgiveness stood taller than their uniforms. He had taken the pain without anger, and now he was guiding the crowd toward peace instead of violence. That was the difference between him and them. That was why, even tased and humiliated, Keanu Reeves still looked like the strongest man in the room. The terminal was filled with noise, angry voices from the crowd, nervous whispers from the officers, and the soft hum of people recording with their phones. Yet in the center of it all stood Keanu, weak from the shock but steady in spirit. He looked around, his eyes calm, his breathing heavy but controlled. His presence alone slowly quieted the storm. The passengers wanted answers. They wanted justice. They shouted at the officers, demanding they be punished. Some even wanted them arrested on the spot. They attacked him for no reason, someone yelled. This is abuse of power, another shouted. The officers stood frozen, pale and sweating. They knew they had lost the respect of everyone there. But Keanu, even after being tased and humiliated, raised his hand gently. His voice came out low but carried across the silence that began to spread. Please don't be angry, he said. His tone was so soft, so full of patience, that it stunned the crowd into listening. His words were not filled with bitterness but with compassion. The passengers blinked in disbelief. Here was a man who had been treated like a criminal, yet instead of shouting, he was asking them to calm down. His humility was something they couldn't ignore. The little boy who had shouted his name earlier looked up with wide eyes. He whispered to his mother, "He's still kind." Even after all this, the officers felt the weight of his words like a punch in their hearts. They couldn't understand it. They had hurt him, embarrassed him, and yet he was protecting them from the wrath of the crowd. One officer's eyes filled with tears. He lowered his head, ashamed. Keanu took a small step forward. Supported by a kind stranger on each side, he looked directly at the officers. His voice didn't rise, it didn't shake. It carried strength in its gentleness. "I'm okay, mistakes happen," he said. His words shocked everyone. The crowd gasped. Some shook their heads in disbelief. How could he forgive them so easily? The officer who had fired the taser felt his knees weaken. He wanted to speak, but his throat closed. Finally, with a trembling voice, he said, "Sir, I'm so sorry, I thought—" But he couldn't finish. The shame was too much. The crowd booed at his attempt, but Keanu simply gave the smallest nod. He didn't excuse the act, but he didn't pour salt on the wound either. "Let this go," Keanu whispered. "Don't carry hate." His words were not just for the crowd, they were for the officers too. His wisdom cut through the tension like sunlight through storm clouds. People began to fall quiet, staring at him in awe. The passengers looked at each other, some wiping tears. They saw a man who could have demanded punishment, who could have shouted in anger, but instead he stood with grace for many. It was proof of why Keanu was so respected, not for his fame, not for his movies, but for his heart. The little boy's voice rose again. Innocent and honest, he's the best, Mom. He's a real hero. The mother, who had doubted earlier, nodded with tears in her eyes. Yes, honey, he is, she whispered. Her words carried the truth everyone felt in that moment. The officers couldn't hide their emotions anymore. Their faces were red with shame. One of them whispered under his breath, "We don't deserve this forgiveness." Another rubbed his forehead, trying to hide the tears welling up. Their badges and uniforms, once symbols of authority, now felt heavy on their chests. Keanu straightened his back slowly. His strength seemed to return not from his body but from his spirit. He looked at the passengers and said, "Please don't attack them. Don't harass them. They made a mistake, but hate won't fix it." The crowd listened, torn between their anger and their respect for him. In the end, his words carried more weight than their fury. People lowered their phones. Some stopped shouting instead of anger. Admiration filled the air. They realized they were witnessing something rare. A man responding to cruelty with kindness. A man turning humiliation into a lesson of forgiveness. The officers stood trembling, staring at him. One of them finally whispered, "We will never forget this, sir," another added. "We'll accept whatever punishment comes, but thank you for showing us mercy." Their voices cracked with sincerity. They were broken men standing before someone far greater than them, not because of fame, but because of humanity. Keanu gave a faint smile. His eyes warmed despite the pain. "Be better next time," he said softly. Those words weren't harsh, they weren't meant to wound. They were a reminder, a chance for redemption. And the officers knew those words would echo in their minds for the rest of their lives. The crowd began to applaud, not because the scene was over, but because they had seen something unforgettable. They clapped not just for Keanu Reeves, the actor, but for Keanu Reeves, the man, a man who showed the world that real strength wasn't in anger, but in forgiveness. The airport scene slowly calmed. But the story was only beginning. Dozens of passengers had captured every second on their phones. The video showed Keanu standing quietly, the officers surrounding him, the shocking moment of the taser, and finally, his calm words of forgiveness. Within minutes, those videos were already being uploaded online, spreading like wildfire. By the time Keanu left the airport, the world had already begun to react. Social media exploded with posts. Hashtags like "Justice for Keanu," "Keanu Forgives," and a Chan airport incident trended across platforms. People shared the clips over and over, each one showing the moment their beloved actor was treated unfairly, and yet responded with kindness. News channels picked up the story quickly. They replayed the video of Keanu falling after being tased, replayed the boy shouting his name, replayed Keanu whispering softly, "I'm fine, and please, don't be angry." Millions watched in disbelief. They couldn't understand how someone so famous could be mistaken and treated so cruelly. But at the same time, people admired him even more. Instead of suing, instead of screaming, instead of attacking the officers, Keanu had shown grace. His words of forgiveness became the highlight of every headline. Keanu Reeves shows humanity at airport. Star responds to brutality with kindness. The day Keanu forgave. The officers who once stood tall in the airport now faced the weight of the world. Their faces were everywhere, frozen in the moment of panic, frozen in the moment of pressing the taser. They couldn't hide. The world judged them harshly. People demanded answers, demanded punishment. Some wanted them removed from duty forever. And yet Keanu himself didn't push for that. When reporters finally reached him, his answer was simple. "I don't want to see anyone's life destroyed. They made a mistake. And I forgive them." Those words stunned everyone. Forgiveness in a world so hungry for revenge felt almost unbelievable. But that was Keanu's way. Humility instead of pride. Peace instead of anger. The little boy who had shouted his name became part of the story too. His voice had been the first to make the crowd realize who Keanu was. In interviews, his mother explained how her son had recognized his hero instantly. The boy simply said, "I just wanted them to stop hurting him. He's a good man." His innocence touched millions. Around the world, fans and strangers alike spoke of the incident. They praised Keanu for his patience, his grace, his ability to rise above humiliation. They said this was why he was loved, not because of his roles as Neo or John Wick, but because of the man behind the characters, the man who treated even his enemies with kindness. Videos of the crowd applauding him spread widely. People admired how strangers had come together to support him. Some even called it a lesson for the world, a reminder that humanity was still alive. And at the center of it all stood Keanu, a man who had walked into the airport quietly and left as an example for millions. The officers themselves eventually made public statements. Their voices cracked with regret. They admitted their mistake. They apologized directly to Keanu and to the world, but many people said it wasn't their apology that mattered. It was Keanu's response that would never be forgotten. In homes across the globe, people replayed his words again and again. Please, don't be angry. Mistakes happen. Don't carry hate. Those phrases echoed not just as answers to the incident, but as lessons about life. Children learned from it. Adults admired it. Even critics who usually found flaws in everything said they couldn't deny his greatness. The incident that could have been remembered as a scandal became remembered as a moment of inspiration, all because of how Keanu chose to respond. Weeks later, the story still lived on. People continued to share it. Not with anger anymore, but with admiration. It became one more proof of Keanu's character, proof that fame hadn't spoiled him, proof that even in pain, he carried kindness in his heart for many. It wasn't just about a celebrity being tased by mistake. It was about how a human being responded to cruelty with compassion, about how humility was stronger than pride. It was a reminder that true power didn't come from uniforms, weapons, or authority, but from patience, dignity, and forgiveness. Keanu went back to his life quietly, never making the story about himself. He didn't seek attention, didn't demand anything. He simply moved on. But the world didn't forget. His example continued to shine, and millions said they respected him now more than ever. In the end, the faces that had changed the most were not just the officers, but the faces of everyone who saw the story. From the passengers at the airport to the millions watching on their screens, they all carried a new lesson, a reminder of the power of kindness. And all of it came from one man who chose forgiveness over anger.